The screaming hit Lieutenant Hayes like a physical blow. Not his screaming, the ship's screaming, 200,000 voices crying out through twisted metal that still remembered how to die. He was Marcus Rodriguez, 23, and dying, his fingers tracing a child's crayon drawing, while radiation ate through his organs like acid. All he could think was, someone has to tell Esperanza that Daddy tried to come home. He was Lieutenant Sarah Kim, dictating her mother's apple pie recipe into her helmet recorder because someone should remember the exact way her Halmione measured sugar. Her blood turned to poison, but her voice stayed steady. 3 cups flour, sifted twice, add cinnamon while the mixture is still warm. He was Sergeant Carlos Torres, praying in Spanish while manually sealing a breach that would save 17 lives but cost him his own. His abuela's words flowing like water. Santa Maria, Madre de Dios, ruega por nosotros pecadores. 17 different people dying, 17 different ways. And each one focused not on their ending, but on the people they were leaving behind. Not fear, but love. Not despair, but desperate hope that someone would carry their stories home. Captain Sarah Blake's voice cut through the psychic storm. Hayes, back to the pod. Now. The young soldier stumbled away from the fused bulkhead, his suit's readings spiking red. Captain, I felt them all. Every single one. Focus on my voice. Blake guided him toward extraction. Your Lieutenant Marcus Hayes. Serial number 7749 Delta. You're alive. You're going home. Behind them, the Carthage Memorial Drift breathed like something alive. Metal surfaces weeping condensation that tasted of copper and fear. 3 months earlier, senior auditor Vex High reviewed the footage with mounting disgust. Humans volunteer to dive into radioactive graveyards just to drag out corpses, and the council pays them for this madness? Junior analyst Crix shifted nervously in the doorway. The resource allocation is substantial, auditor. Substantial was charitable. The Human Recovery Corps had burned through 17 planetary defense budgets, recovering what any rational species would call space garbage. Dead meat that should have been recycled decades ago. Through Waystation Omega's viewport, their latest target hung against the stars. 847 ships melted together into shapes that hurt to perceive. 200,000 humans had died there in 6 minutes, when the hegemony's exotic weapon turned their own fleet into their tomb. The human vessel, Reunion, is requesting permission to dock. Crix reported. They're expecting you. Vex High's thorax contracted with irritation. The council had assigned her to document this waste. To prove that humanity's obsession with corpse collection was bleeding resources from actual defense. Simple enough. She had no idea she was about to witness the apex predator of the galaxy. The Reunion settled into its berth with practiced precision. Captain Sarah Blake emerged first, smaller than her file suggested, with graying hair and lines around her eyes from staring into vacuum too often. Auditor Vex High. Blake extended her hand. Welcome aboard. I understand you're here to observe our latest exercise in resource mismanagement. The sarcasm was unmistakable. Vex High accepted the handshake, noting calluses from hands-on work rather than administrative comfort. As they moved through the ship, she calculated lost storage space. Thousands of small plaques bearing names and faces cluttered every surface. I'm here to document expenditures, Vex High said. The council remains concerned about allocating funds to recover expired biological matter. Blake's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. Expired biological matter? What else would you call organic material that ceased function 37 years ago? Their names. Dr. Marcus Webb emerged from a side corridor, carrying a worn leather case like it contained religious artifacts. We call them by their names, Auditor. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka appeared next, her movements sharp and economical as she directed equipment that looked more like shrine components than recovery tools. Everything was engraved, personalized, treated with museum-like reverence. They passed through corridors lined with memorial walls, photographs, handwritten letters, children's artwork arranged with curatorial care. Vex High tried to process the inefficiency and found herself studying individual faces instead. a young woman in uniform holding a baby, an older man with laugh lines around his eyes, a teenager who couldn't have been more than 18. "Dr. Webb," she managed, consulting her slate. "Your file indicates scientific training. Why does a researcher participate in body recovery?" Webb's fingers traced a photograph with curator precision. "Because sentiment is science. Auditor, when you know Private Rodriguez kept his daughter's drawing in his left breast pocket, you know which direction his body will face when you find him trying to get back to her one last time." Vexhi's mandibles twitched. "You navigate by emotion? We navigate by understanding," Blake corrected, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining basics to a child. The briefing room should have been a tactical center. Instead, it resembled a shrine. Walls covered with ship schematics, photographs, handwritten letters, and children's artwork. In the center, a holographic display showed their target. The UES Thermopylae hung in the simulation like a metal coffin, its hull cracked but not shattered. 17 life sign echoes still flickered in its communications section, bodies preserved by the same exotic radiation that had killed them. "Every civilized species has declared the drift forbidden," Vexhi noted. "The radiation readings alone should have dispersed any recoverable matter." "Should have," Tanaka agreed, manipulating the hologram. "But the weapon created preservation pockets. Some sections are perfectly intact." Vexhi studied the display, then glanced at Blake. "This vessel holds personal significance?" Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My brother served aboard the Thermopylae. Communications Specialist First Class, David Blake." She gestured to the 17 signatures. "But we're not just going for him. The whole communications section got cut off when the weapon hit. They had time to seal their compartment, time to prepare." "Prepare for what? They were already dying." Webb spoke quietly while arranging photographs. They had time to record final messages, time to gather personal effects from other sections, time to arrange themselves so their bodies would be found with dignity. He met Vexhi's gaze. "They died taking care of each other. But why waste final moments on administrative tasks?" "Because they knew someone would come for them," Blake said simply. "And we did." But now Tanaka was frowning at her readings. "Captain, the drift's gravitational field is shifting. These exotic matter pockets are destabilizing faster than projected. How long do we have?" 6 hours before the Thermopylae section becomes unreachable. Maybe less. Blake studied the tactical display. 3 living crew members. 17 dead promises. 6 hours to navigate a psychic minefield that had driven 3 species to madness. Vexhi watched the interplay of glances between the humans. Something unspoken passed between them. Not doubt, but acknowledgement of cost. "There's another issue," Webb said quietly. "Command's been asking questions. They want to know if these recovery missions are worth the resources, worth the risk to living crews." Blake's hand hovered over the controls. "And what did you tell them? That you'd have an answer after this mission?" The alien auditor realized she was witnessing a crucible moment. This wasn't routine recovery. This was humanity deciding whether its most dangerous promise was worth keeping. The approach to the Carthage Drift defied description. As they drew closer, the twisted mass resolved into nightmare detail. The corridors sang lullabies in dead voices. Gravity flowed like honey, thick and wrong, pulling in directions that didn't exist. Metal curved through dimensions Vexhi's species had no names for. "Radiation levels are manageable," Tanaka reported. "The exotic weapon created interference patterns that preserved organic matter. It's also what makes this place a psychological hazard." "Hazard how?" Vexhi asked, though her thorax was already contracting with dread. "Memory plague," Blake said without looking away from the displays. "The weapon didn't just fuse matter, it fused experiences. Get too close to certain sections, and you'll live through every death simultaneously." Vexhi's translator must have malfunctioned. "Simultaneously?" "All at once. Every death, every scream, every last thought." Blake's smile was disturbingly cheerful. "Try not to lose your mind. And you're going in anyway." "Someone has to." Blake's hand moved toward the extraction controls. "Those 17 communications specialists aren't just bodies to us, Auditor. They're promises we made. Even at the cost of living crew? Blake turned to face her fully. What happens when soldiers know, absolutely know, that their civilization will dive into hell to bring them home? That no matter how they die, someone will come for them? Military efficiency would improve, Vex High replied automatically. Soldiers would focus on survival rather than sentiment. Tanaka actually laughed. Auditor, you've never seen humans fight when they know someone will come for them no matter what. We don't fight harder when we think we'll survive. We fight harder when we know our deaths won't be meaningless. The dive pods were marvels of human over-engineering, bristling with equipment that could outfit a small ship. As they descended into the drift's twisted corridors, Vex High began to understand why 3 other species had fled this place screaming. The wreckage breathed. Metal corridors expanded and contracted like ribs, their surfaces slick with condensation that smelled of ozone and old blood. But Blake navigated the chaos like she'd done it 1,000 times, her movements economical and sure. How do you pilot through this? Vex High asked, watching impossible geometry slide past their viewport. Experience, Blake replied. And because we study every recovered personal effect, when you know how someone lived, you can predict how they moved when they were dying. They reached the communications section after 43 minutes of careful maneuvering. The blast doors had been sealed from the inside, but sensors showed 17 distinct biological signatures beyond, preserved in a state between life and death. Beginning breach protocol, Blake announced. Webb, start mapping personal effects. Tanaka, monitor structural integrity. But as the blast doors cycled open, revealing humanity's strangest monument, the memory plague struck again. This time, Vex High was ready for the psychic assault, but not for what she experienced. She wasn't just feeling their deaths, she was feeling their love, Rodriguez's desperate need to tell his daughter he tried to come home, Kim's determination to preserve her grandmother's recipe, Torres's certainty that his prayer would somehow reach the people he was dying to protect. For the first time in her logical, efficient life, she experienced something beyond calculation. The raw, overwhelming power of beings who chose connection over survival, love over logic. The memories faded gradually, leaving her gasping. Around her, the human team continued their work, as if sharing 17 deaths was routine. How do you function through that? She whispered. Because it's not our pain, Auditor, Blake said, sealing another body bag with practiced movements. It's theirs, and carrying their pain for a few minutes is the least we can do. Webb was cataloging personal effects with scientific precision. Every item gets logged, every message gets transcribed, every body gets identified and prepared for transport home. But the 17 bodies weren't just arranged, they'd been curated. In their final hours, they'd gone through the ship and gathered personal effects from hundreds of dead sections, photographs, letters, mementos, arranged with museum-like care. They turned this place into a memorial. Webb breathed. Blake approached one body, a young man barely past adolescence. David, she whispered, and Vex High realized this was her brother. But instead of lingering, Blake continued to the next station. Rodriguez, Kim, Torres, Jackson, each name spoken with identical reverence. Why treat strangers the same as family? Vex High asked. Because someone loved them too. Blake gestured to the memorial walls. These aren't strangers. They're somebody's everything. The extraction should have been routine. Load 17 body bags, return to the reunion, file a report. But the drift had other plans. The first tremor was subtle. The second brought down a corridor section. The third opened a hull breach that shrieked with escaping atmosphere. Structural collapse, Tanaka shouted. The whole section is destabilizing. Blake's voice cut through chaos with deadly precision. Emergency extraction. All pods back to the reunion. Now. What about the bodies? Webb asked, struggling with cargo. Leave them, Blake ordered, and Vex High felt relief that humans had finally chosen logic. But as they reached the loading area, Blake stopped. 17 body bags scattered across the collapsing compartment. Too many for a single trip. Too heavy for damaged equipment. Go, she told her team. Get back to the ship. Captain, no, Tanaka protested. We can make another run. There won't be time. Blake studied her readings. Cascade failure will reach the power core in 4 minutes. This section will be vaporized. Vex High watched in mounting horror as Blake began dragging body bags toward the pods herself. This is madness! They're already dead! You're risking 3 living beings for 17 corpses! Blake paused, fixing her with a steady gaze. You call them expired biological matter. Her voice carried cold precision. I call them David, Marcus, Sarah, Torres. Each name dropped like a stone. What do you call the things you die for, auditor? That was when Vex High understood. This wasn't inefficiency or sentiment. This was the foundation of everything that made humanity terrifyingly effective. Absolute, unshakable trust. When Blake's team saw their captain risking her life for bodies that couldn't benefit, they didn't see madness. They saw proof that if they died, she would do the same for them. Webb, Tanaka, prep the pods for overload transport, Blake continued. We're taking everyone home in one trip. The pods aren't rated for that mass, Tanaka warned. Then we make them work. Blake's hands never shook. Auditor, you're going to help us. I'm not trained for. You're trained to calculate resource allocation. Blake's words came fast, urgent. Well, calculate this. Every human who serves in deep space knows that if they don't make it home alive, their captain will risk everything to bring them home dead. That knowledge is worth more than our entire fleet. The return journey was nightmare and revelation combined. Vex High found herself wedged between body bags, her suit scraping against makeshift cargo netting. The pod groaned with every maneuver, pushed far beyond design limits, but Blake piloted with the same steady competence she'd shown throughout. Her hands never shook, her voice never wavered, her focus never shifted from getting everyone, living and dead, back to safety. Metal screamed around them. Warning lights painted the cramped space hellish red. The pod's frame twisted under impossible stress, and still, Blake held course. Reunion control, this is Blake. She radioed as they approached. Requesting emergency docking. We've got 17 coming home. Confirmed, Captain, came the response. Medical team standing by. No medical needed, Blake replied quietly. Just the preparation teams. As they docked, Vex High watched the crew handle the bodies with reverence that bordered on worship. Each bag was logged, each personal effect catalogued, each identity confirmed and verified. Captain, she said, as they supervised the transfer, if you had been forced to choose between saving your team and completing this recovery, which would you have chosen? Blake didn't hesitate. My team. Always. But then why risk? Because I wasn't forced to choose. Blake's fingers traced a child's drawing taped to one of the bags. That's the point, auditor. When you refuse to abandon the dead, you very rarely have to abandon the living. When your people know you'll come for them no matter what, they fight harder to make sure you don't have to. 3 days later, Vex High stood in her office, staring at a report that should have been simple. The numbers on her screen weren't statistics. They were love letters written in light years and lives. Human units with active recovery protocols suffered 43% fewer casualties than comparable forces. Human soldiers fought with supernatural tenacity when they knew their civilization would never abandon them. Human military morale consistently rated highest in the galaxy despite serving the most dangerous sectors. Every human who died knew, absolutely knew, that their civilization would tear apart reality to bring them home. That certainty didn't make them fight harder to survive. It made them fight harder to be worth the effort. Her door chimed. Enter. Crix bustled in carrying another data slate. Auditor, the casualty reports from the hegemony border conflicts. The humans have achieved impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Vex High reviewed the numbers with growing amazement. In sector after sector, human forces were winning not through superior technology or tactics, but through simple willingness to die for people who would do the same for them. She thought of Blake's team working with perfect coordination, of Webb cataloging trinkets that were someone's final connection to home, of Tanaka pushing her equipment beyond limits because 17 families deserved closure, and she thought of the memory plague of experiencing humans who spent their dying breaths taking care of each other. Crix, she said finally, Prepare a transmission to the Galactic Council. What should it say, Auditor? Vex-High flexed her manipulator arms, choosing words with scientific precision. Recommendation: immediate expansion of Human Recovery Corps operations to all sectors. Previous assessment was incorrect. Humans don't waste resources on the dead, they invest in the living. Any species willing to dive into hell for corpses will move mountains for allies. She paused, remembering Blake's steady hands, piloting an overloaded pod through collapsing wreckage. In a galaxy full of predators, we just found the apex species. As she transmitted the report, Vex-High thought of 17 families who would soon receive bodies, personal effects, and final messages from loved ones who died 37 years ago. The cost in resources was staggering. The risk to living crew defied calculation. But the value, the knowledge that someone would always come home, no matter what, that was priceless. And maybe, she realized as she watched the reunion depart for its next impossible mission, that was the most terrifying military advantage the galaxy had ever seen. 1 week later, Vex-High submitted her transfer request. She wanted assignment to human units. She wanted to understand how a species that refused to abandon their dead had become the one thing in the universe that nothing else dared abandon. The Council approved her request without question. After all, everyone wanted to study the apex predators. End of recording.